So we're here in Davos, and this is a big year for the World Economic Forum, in part because of the 50th anniversary, but also in part because it's the 20th anniversary of Gavi, the vaccine initiative. Here with Seth Berkley, who's the CEO of Gavi, one of the world's leading advocates for vaccines. First of all, congratulations on this big anniversary. How does it feel to be at this point?
So thanks so much, Raj. And I've been a long-time attendee here at the World Economic Forum, and this really is one of the most important initiatives that were launched by the forum. So it's wonderful to have a chance to step back a little bit and celebrate what's happened, but even more importantly, look at what we're going to do in the future.
And speaking of what you're going to do in the future, the big issue, of course, on everyone's mind when it comes to Gavi is replenishment. The global health community kind of held their breath and worked hard to get two big replenishments through, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the Global Fund. You're kind of up next. How does it look so far? Give us a sense of how the picture is starting to be painted.
So we're looking to have our replenishment on June 4th in the UK, hosted by the Prime Minister there. It is in 2020, so we hope it is a new cycle as part of the new decade. But of course we are, as you say, the last of a number of replenishments. You know, signals are good. People care about Gavi and the types of issues that we're talking about. But of course it is a uncertain time in the world, and there are many other priorities as well. So the important thing we have to do is make sure that there is a critical mass of people advocating for this important effort.
Yeah, not least it's an election year in the US. You've just had Brexit's about to happen. There's a lot of other issues on the political calendar, and you'll be in London for this. But everyone in the global health world is certainly looking closely and watching closely at how this will go down. Part of the replenishment is also a change in the way Gavi works. You've got a new strategy out. I think it's Gavi 5.0 is sort of the broad way it's looked at. Give us a quick sketch of what will that mean? How will Gavi actually be different in this new era?
Well, let me go back first for a second. I mean, Gavi's been very successful. It started to launch new vaccines. We've done 430 plus launches in developing countries. Coverage rate has gone up 21%. A number of countries have graduated. Countries are investing more. So all of those indicators are quite positive. The really exciting thing is that today 90% of children in the world have access to a routine vaccine, part of the routine system. Of course, that means that 10% do not. Those zero-dose children are left behind from everything. 2/3 are below the poverty line. If they don't have access to vaccines, they don't have access to health care, to contraception, to any of the other interventions. So what we would like to do is focus in on leaving no one behind, focus in on those zero-dose communities, and try to help governments bring vaccines to them to start with. But of course vaccines don't deliver themselves. So it brings health workers, it brings data systems, it brings supply chains, and that's a way to build universality in healthcare.
Now, what does that mean for middle-income countries? Because some of these zero cases are in middle-income countries. Is Gavi going to change the way you work in those countries?
So, Raj, that's a very important point. By 2030, 70% of the underimmunized are going to be in middle-income countries. So, what we've begun to do is explore a strategy where we might work with the lower end of middle-income countries and try to help them with their procurement of products. Because many of those countries would like to roll out vaccines, but the higher prices are just too much for them to take on when they're on the lower end of the income scale. So can we find a sweet spot where industry sees this as profitable? Countries also say this makes sense for us and we want to roll out vaccines, and if we can do that, that'll be one of the new strategies we'll roll out.
Yeah, I hear when I talk to ministers of health and other global health professionals, I hear different strains of challenges that Gavi is going to face. One is a couple of them you just referred to, transitions. How to get countries that are getting richer to still turn around and spend more of their budget on health, especially on vaccines, so you don't lose the ground that's been made. Another is pricing. How do you handle pricing issues? And another is this issue of equity. So maybe we can start there, because you talked about the zero case, but what about the case of children who are getting a vaccine, but maybe not getting, there's not enough within the population to get immunity at the level where disease won't spread? How do you think about that equity issue? How's that going to be different going forward?
So, of course, what we want is every child, every family, to be fully vaccinated. So today, I focused on the zero-dose children. There's about 10.4 million of those, and those are the most deprived of all. Those are the ones that are farthest behind. There's another about 10 million that are under-immunized. That is, they've been in the routine system, but they've dropped out from it. And it's obviously critical to make sure that they are vaccinated as well. Different solutions for the two problems. One is to make sure there's confidence confidence, and that they're able to bring their children back for vaccinations, make sure the service is there. The other one is really bringing services, sometimes for the first time. And today, that's urban slums, it's in refugee situations.
Yeah, not just the last mile in a rural area.
It's not. We used to think of that tukul out in the rural area as kind of the sign of what we have to get to, but today, much more. It's the 40% of those people are refugees, with the largest number of refugees in history.
One health minister I was speaking to recently said he'd love to see Gavi provide more flexible funding, where they can get some cash, not just vaccines, in order to build out those distribution systems. How do you see that evolving? What would be your response to that kind of request from a health minister?
Well, of course, we do provide cash. In this period, it's been about $1.3 billion for health system strengthening. Next period, it's estimated to be at least $1.2 billion. It'll depend upon the replenishment. We're asking for at least $7.4 billion. The at least relates to trying to get more money in for this type of health systems work that's necessary. So we're trying to help those countries. Of course, we can't finance the entire health system. What we can do is give catalytic funding that then can be followed by funding from the countries. The last thing I'd say is that we have to remember that this is prevention. It saves money. For every dollar invested, you get a $54 return. So for countries, if they invest in this, it'll mean they'll have more money for the rest of their health system to move forward on universal health coverage.
Speaking about money, let's talk about pricing for a second. MSF and others have pushed back on pricing agreements you have, especially with the pneumonia vaccine. How do you balance those questions of buying vaccines from major pharmaceutical companies, maybe at prices that developing countries would say are too high, as you referenced earlier? How do you think about that? Will anything change in the way you think about drug pricing going forward?
Well, first of all, let's look at the facts. I mean, today, obviously, pneumococcal vaccines cost different amounts, but up until recently, there's been two suppliers. They're Western manufacturers, and those vaccines cost about $600 for a course in the West. We're paying under $9 for that same course. So we're talking about a massive reduction to start with. Now, we can reasonably disagree, is that the best price? But when you look at it compared to what other countries are paying, it's a dramatic reduction. We have new manufacturers coming in. We have a new Indian manufacturer that is pre-qualified, perhaps will come in at a different price, but of course what we ultimately want is a healthy, competitive marketplace that'll allow us to make sure there's supply security and the best pricing as possible. So I think we're moving in that direction.
Let's talk about a couple other vaccine areas. One is Ebola. I'd love to get your take just on where we currently are with the Ebola crisis, the Ebola situation. And then we've got an interventional vaccine, we've got prevention vaccines. How do you think about the rollout and utility of those kinds of vaccines when it comes to Ebola?
Well, the first thing is, we were obviously delighted that there was a vaccine that worked in outbreaks. And as you know, the Merck product in the outbreak in Guinea showed a very high efficacy rate, 100% in that trial, later on in the high 90s. It's a great vaccine. It has now been licensed and pre-qualified. So we're moving from use of it in an experimental fashion to having a regular stockpile. We had made sure that 300,000 doses of the experimental vaccine were available in case there was an outbreak. Thank goodness we did that, because there was a number of outbreaks. The challenge is 262,000 people have been immunized in this outbreak, the current North Kivu outbreak, and it's still going on. That's not a vaccine problem. In the Bandika outbreak, we vaccinated when the cases were going up. On day 13, I was there for the first vaccination, and then it went right down. The problem is getting access to the communities and having people bring sick people forward. And today they should, because we have treatment and vaccines. If you do that and you have the contacts, we have the tools now to stop the epidemic quickly. But there's been, as you know, attacks on health workers, and it's been a really tough situation. That's what has to get fixed.
You've been working on vaccines your whole career. How do you assess this current dynamic where you have, in cases like there in Congo, attacks on health workers, attacks on clinics? You've got in the West anti-vaxxers and a debate about the efficacy of vaccines. How do you think about the current status of vaccines and kind of the global culture?
Well, it's a tough issue. I mean, those are two separate things. That outbreak occurred this time in one of the most difficult places in the DRC, a place that's had a war going on for a long time, lots of rebels, distrust. So that explains what's happening there. The broader issue of anti-vaccine, activity, hesitancy is a real problem. I mean, the country that has the least confidence of vaccine in the world is France. I mean, the home of Louis Pasteur. You would not expect it.
The ultimate irony.
So what's interesting about that is is part of a broader movement of lack of trust in experts, in lack of having high quality data and expertise. We've got to fix that, not just for vaccines, which is life-threatening, but for all areas. I mean, here we are in Davos talking about climate. You have to believe the science behind it. If you don't believe the science, where are we?
Yeah. Let me ask you about one maybe very hopeful area. You spent much of your career working on HIV and trying to develop a vaccine for that in partnership with many groups around the world. When I talk to scientists in this space now, they say we are closer than ever, maybe tantalizingly close to an efficacious HIV vaccine. First of all, how do you read the current state of the vaccine development for HIV? And then what will it actually mean for the world? I mean, I would imagine for Gavi, it would mean potentially a massive transformation, as for many of the global health institutions, some of the biggest in the world that today focus on treatment when it comes to HIV.
Well, I mean, of course, I would like nothing better than to have the problem of how do we get an HIV vaccine out to the world. I certainly spent a lot of my life thinking about that. Of course, I've also worked long enough with HIV to know what a difficult organism it is. And so whether we're on the cusp or not, very hard to tell. But certainly science is making progress, and I believe in the power of science. So I think we will get there at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. The thing that HIV vaccine will change is it will really mean we could think about ending AIDS. Because right now, although that is a political slogan that people use, the truth is we continue to have new infections all the time. Use of prevention is going down in young people, in adolescent girls and others. And so although we need to redouble our effort there, the only way we'll end this epidemic is with a vaccine.
And when you think about this at Gavi, with your Gavi hat on, are there discussions internally today? Are you doing contingency planning about what would happen if a vaccine like this became available? How ready would we be to roll this out? Because presumably some of the countries with a high burden would want to move very quickly if there were an HIV vaccine.
Well, of course, it depends upon the characteristics of the vaccine, how it would be used, which populations it would be set for. So it's a little early to have that full range of conversations. But today, we're on the cusp of having potentially a new TB vaccine, which is really promising. We also have implementation trials underway for malaria vaccines, which may be another tool in the armamentarium. So we've got the opportunity to roll out other vaccines for important areas and really begin to, prepare the ground for when there is an HIV vaccine.
If some of these things come to pass, and Gavi finds really it needed a larger replenishment than maybe what you got, is the system set up in such a way that you could go back out to donors? I mean, how do you think about the reality that maybe in the future Gavi needs to be a much larger institution?
Well, of course, at the end of the day, if there's more need, we will go back out. But I think the interesting question for that is, how does that play in the overall development space? Because the Global Fund, of course, is spending an enormous amount on treatment. They will still need to do that, but they spend on prevention as well. So we have to think about this in a combined way, PEPFAR, other initiatives as well. So this would be a really interesting conversation on what resources can the world bring to bear on this very important problem. Of course, we would use the systems, the experience we have to move things forward, but it might be something that we could fund in somewhat different ways.
Yeah, I've had discussions with people looking at launching new kinds of alliances like Gavi's, and they say maybe the era of replenishments is over. We had a few institutions that are able to do this successfully, but boy, in this political environment, it is tough.
But let me say why that's so important, though. What we're trying to do, the secret sauce of Gavi, was the idea of creating a marketplace with long-term predictability that would allow companies to invest and would allow new companies to enter. To do that, you have to have some visibility out. Now, innovative financing mechanisms like IFM allowed us to have a very long time horizon, but the idea of having a 5-year commitment, the manufacturers know, okay, the money's in the bank, they are really going to be able to pay, and therefore will invest the hundreds of millions of dollars necessary to scale up production. That's the problem we've had in the past. If tomorrow there was a vaccine for HIV and there was nobody there to make it available for the poorest countries, how do the companies invest massively in the volumes they need? We buy vaccines for 60% of the world's kids. That's massive volumes, and it's only because we have this reliable financing.
So just one last question. We are another big year of 2020 is that we're 10 years out on the global goals. Vaccines are a big part of it, not the only part though. You've been in this space for a long time. You know most of the leaders in the UN institutions and the development agencies, the NGOs. How do you read it? How do you read where we are today, 10 years out?
I think obviously for many of those goals we won't get there, but as we saw with the MDGs, it took a while to get started and then you had kind of a rush near the end. I think what's interesting is we have the intellectual power and we have the technologies that can make a difference. The challenge is putting those together, and I think having a mindset that says we're going to try to drive this forward and really move us towards as close as we can get, and then, you know, after 2030 it will be critical to make those goals as true as possible. And if we do things like reach every child with immunization, leave no one behind, of course we won't be happy with that, but that means there's a health worker, there's a system, there's supply chain, and therefore you can tag other things onto it.
Sure. Well, this is a story we're going to continue watching very closely, as will many others in this space. Good luck in this replenishment year. Nice to spend some time in the snow with you.
Thanks so much. Great to see you as well. Thank you.